My brother's fiancée laughed while I was forced to sit next to a trash can at their engagement dinner. Her family thought I was paying for the entire $4,000 party. When the bill arrived, I stood up and said one sentence that silenced the entire restaurant. Minutes later, his fiancée was staring at him like she'd just discovered who he really was. The wedding never happened. I am 36 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the dependable one in my family. My name is Nathan Caldwell, and I live in Denver, Colorado, where I work as a financial analyst. My life is quiet, organized, and predictable, which is something I have always told people I prefer. I have a small townhouse, a reliable car, a stable career, and a routine that rarely changes. On the outside, it probably looks like I built the exact life I wanted, but the truth is that most of my life has been shaped by one role that somehow became permanent without anyone ever officially assigning it to me. I am the responsible brother. My younger brother, Tyler, has always been the opposite of me in every possible way. Where I am quiet and careful, Tyler is loud, charismatic, and reckless. Growing up, people used to call him charming. Teachers laughed at his jokes, even when he disrupted class. Neighbors described him as full of life. My parents adored that energy and treated it like something special, something that couldn't be restrained or criticized too harshly, because it was just how Tyler is. Meanwhile, I learned very early that the easiest way to exist in the house was to stay out of trouble and solve problems quietly before anyone had to ask. By the time I was in high school, I was already working part-time jobs to save money for college. I never expected my parents to pay for it because they were already struggling financially. My father had been laid off more than once during those years, and my mother's job never paid enough to make things comfortable. I filled out scholarship applications, took extra shifts, and eventually managed to pay my own way through college with a mix of grants, loans, and long hours of work that left me constantly exhausted. No one really celebrated that achievement. It was simply accepted as something I was supposed to do. During that same period, Tyler drifted through life without much direction. He started college twice and dropped out both times. He jumped between part-time jobs, quit when things got boring, and eventually moved back into my parents' house more than once when rent or responsibilities caught up with him. Every time it happened, my parents framed it as Tyler just figuring things out. They praised his personality, his social skills, his ability to make friends anywhere. Somehow his instability was interpreted as potential rather than problem. Meanwhile, I became the person everyone quietly depended on whenever something went wrong. When my parents had trouble paying a medical bill, I helped cover it. When the water heater in their house broke, I paid for replacement without much discussion. If Tyler needed help covering rent after quitting another job, my parents would gently suggest that maybe I could lend him some money just until he got back on his feet. It always sounded temporary, reasonable, like the kind of thing a supportive family member would do. I told myself it didn't bother me because technically I could afford it. Family gatherings slowly turned into situations where I felt like a background character in my own life. I was always invited. Of course. No one ever excluded me outright. But there was a subtle difference between being present and actually being included. Tyler would dominate the room with stories about whatever he'd been doing lately, usually exaggerated and occasionally ridiculous, and everyone would laugh like he was the most entertaining person alive. My parents would proudly tell relatives about Tyler's latest plans or the new opportunity he was excited about. When conversations turned toward me, it was usually brief and practical. Nathan is still working at that finance job in Denver. Nathan is doing well, very stable. Nathan has always been responsible. Those were the kinds of sentences people use when describing me, as if stability was a personality trait rather than the result of years of discipline and sacrifice. Sometimes Tyler would make small jokes at my expense during these gatherings, harmless-sounding comments about how serious I was, or how I probably scheduled my weekends in spreadsheets. Everyone would laugh, including me, because it was easy to laugh and to point out that I had spent years quietly cleaning up problems that no one else wanted to deal with. For a long time, I convinced myself that I genuinely preferred this dynamic. I told myself I liked my quiet life and didn't need constant praise or attention. I focused on my career, built financial security, and kept my expectations low when it came to family recognition. That narrative worked well enough for years because it allowed me to ignore a growing sense of distance that I couldn't quite explain. The truth is that resentment does not appear all at once. It builds slowly in small moments that seem insignificant on their own. A joke that goes a little too far. A favor that turns into an expectation. A conversation where someone thanks Tyler for being there for family, even though you were the one paying the bill that kept things functioning. Each moment feels minor enough to ignore, but together they form a pattern that becomes impossible to completely overlook. I rarely acknowledge those feelings even to myself. Whenever a thought like that surfaced, I pushed it aside and reminded myself that families are complicated and imperfect. I told myself Tyler needed more support because he struggled more than I did. I told myself my parents didn't mean any harm and that they were simply proud of both of us in different ways. But somewhere underneath that calm surface, there was a quiet realization that had been growing stronger over the years. I had spent most of my life being a dependable brother who fixed problems without recognition, and the longer it continued, the more it began to feel like I was invisible inside my own family. A few months ago, everything seemed to be following the same familiar pattern that my family had maintained for years, and if someone had asked me then, I probably would have said nothing unusual was happening at all. The moment that set everything in motion began with a phone call from my mother on a quiet Tuesday evening while I was finishing some reports at home after work. I remember noticing the tone in her voice almost immediately because it was the same overly sweet tone she tended to use whenever she was about to ask me for some kind of favor that would inevitably become a responsibility. She started the conversation by telling me that Tyler had exciting news and that the whole family was thrilled for him. Apparently, my younger brother had gotten engaged to a woman named Olivia Harper, someone he had been dating for less than a year, but was already planning to marry. I had heard her name a few times before in passing conversations, mostly described as someone who came from a very successful family. My mother made sure to emphasize that detail several times, mentioning that Olivia's parents were well-connected and extremely supportive of the relationship. I congratulated Tyler through my mother, even though he was not actually on the call, and I told her I was happy for him because that seemed like the normal response. Then the tone of the conversation shifted slightly in the subtle way that always meant something was coming next. My mother explained that both families wanted to organize a small engagement dinner in Chicago where Olivia's relatives lived, and that they wanted it to be something elegant and memorable so everyone could celebrate properly. She told me they had found a beautiful rooftop restaurant that offered a private area overlooking the skyline, the kind of place people usually book for weddings or corporate events. As she described the view, the atmosphere, and the decorations the restaurant recommended, I already had a feeling about where the conversation was going. Eventually, she mentioned that the venue required a deposit to reserve the space, and that since the event was only a few weeks away, they needed to secure it quickly before someone else booked the date. She explained that Tyler and Olivia were overwhelmed with wedding planning already, and that my parents were still sorting out travel arrangements. Then she asked if I could possibly handle the reservation and put the deposit on my credit card just to secure everything. She reassured me several times that the family would reimburse me later and that it would only be temporary. By that point, the request felt so familiar that I barely paused to think about it. This was exactly the kind of responsibility that somehow always landed on me. I told her it was not a problem and asked her to send me the details of the venue so I could contact them the next morning. She sounded relieved and thanked me in that warm tone that always made it seem like I was doing something generous for the family rather than stepping into another quiet obligation. The following day during my lunch break, I called the restaurant and spoke with their event coordinator, who walked me through the entire reservation process. She explained that the private rooftop area included decorative lighting, floral arrangements, and a small stage for speeches if the family wanted to use it. The deposit alone was a little over $750, which would guarantee the space for the evening. Without hesitation, I gave them my card information and confirmed the booking. The coordinator also suggested a few additional decorative touches that would make the area feel more personal for an engagement celebration, and for a moment I found myself imagining Tyler actually being grateful when he saw everything arranged. Over the next couple weeks, I exchanged a few emails with the restaurant to finalize small details that my mother said would make the dinner feel more special. I approved the simple decorations they recommended and made sure the private section would be prepared before guests arrived. None of it felt like a burden at the time. In fact, there was a small part of me that quietly hoped this event might finally feel different from all the other family gatherings where I faded into the background. When the evening of the engagement dinner finally arrived, I took an early flight to Chicago, so I would have plenty of time to get ready and arrive before everyone else. I stayed at a hotel not far from the restaurant and spent longer than usual preparing, because I wanted to look presentable and professional for Olivia's family. I wore a tailored dark suit that I normally reserve for important meetings and slipped the engagement card I had written earlier into the inside pocket of my jacket. Before leaving the hotel, I also stopped by a small wine shop nearby and purchased a bottle of vintage champagne that the owner recommended for celebrations. The restaurant itself sat on top of a modern building with wide glass windows that reflected the evening lights of the city. When I reached the rooftop area, the staff had already finished setting up the private section exactly as promised. Soft lighting hung above the tables, small floral arrangements decorated the space, and the skyline stretched out behind the railing in a way that made the entire scene feel surprisingly elegant. It looked exactly like the kind of place people imagine when they pictured a perfect engagement celebration. I arrived a little earlier than the official start time and could already see several people gathered near the tables, including both sides of the family. The space was filled with quiet conversations and the sound of glasses clinking as waiters moved between guests. I adjusted my jacket, held the champagne bottle in one hand and the card in the other, and walked toward the group, expecting at the very least a warm welcome after everything I had helped organize. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe this evening would be different, and that for once I would feel like more than just the invisible, responsible brother who handled things behind the scenes. I walked toward the main table holding the bottle of champagne and the engagement card, still carrying that quiet expectation that at the very least someone would greet me warmly or thank me for helping put everything together. The main table sat in the center of the private section beneath the soft lights that the restaurant had arranged earlier that afternoon, surrounded by both families and a few close friends who were already seated and talking animatedly. Tyler noticed me first. He was leaning back in his chair, with one arm resting casually behind Olivia, while several guests laughed at something he had just said. When he saw me approaching, he gave me a slow smirk that immediately made my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't quite explain yet. For a moment, I assumed he was going to stand up and greet me, or at least introduce me properly to Olivia's relatives, since many of them were clearly people I had never met before. Instead, he simply glanced down toward the table, then pointed lazily across the room with the same amused expression still on his face. Near the far corner of the rooftop space, close to the service station where the waiter stacked extra plates and trays, there was a single cheap folding chair placed beside a small round side table that looked like it had been added as an afterthought. Just behind that spot stood a large black trash bin partially hidden behind a decorative divider. Tyler chuckled lightly as he gestured in that direction, and said in a casual voice that carried just far enough for surrounding guests to hear, "Sorry, man. This table's just for family." For a second I thought I must have misunderstood him, because the sentence sounded so absurd in that moment that it barely registered as real. I was still standing there holding the champagne bottle, like someone who had arrived at the wrong event entirely. A few people at the table laughed awkwardly, the kind of hesitant laughter people use when they are not completely sure whether something is a joke, but they feel socially obligated to react anyway. Tyler looked pleased with himself, as if he had delivered a harmless punchline. My eyes moved briefly toward my parents almost instinctively. My mother was sitting 2 seats away from Tyler, and she had suddenly become very focused on adjusting the napkin in her lap. She did not look at me at all. My father lifted his glass towards someone across the table in a relaxed toast, as though nothing unusual had just happened. No one objected, no one corrected Tyler, and no one made any move to pull out a chair for me. Olivia was sitting beside Tyler, wearing a pale dress and an engagement ring that caught the light every time she lifted her hand. She glanced in my direction once with a neutral expression that suggested she recognized me from earlier introductions, but she did not say hello or acknowledge me in any meaningful way. Within seconds, her attention returned to the conversation happening at the table, as if I had simply been a waiter passing through the room. The entire interaction lasted less than half a minute, but the silence that followed it seemed to stretch endlessly in my mind. Causing a scene in that moment would have drawn attention from everyone on the rooftop, including Olivia's relatives who were clearly unfamiliar with our family dynamics. I felt a heavy wave of embarrassment settle over me, the kind that makes your face feel warm even when the evening air is cool. Without saying anything, I nodded once in Tyler's direction, as if I had accepted the arrangement, and quietly walked across the space toward the folding chair he had pointed out. The cheap metal leg scraped softly against the floor as I pulled it back and sat down beside the small round table that had been left empty. I placed the champagne bottle beside my feet and set the engagement card down on the table, because suddenly it felt strangely inappropriate to bring it over to the main group after that exchange. From where I was sitting, I had a clear view of the entire celebration unfolding under the decorative lights. The main table was filled with conversation and laughter that grew louder as more drinks were poured. Waiters moved between guests carrying plates of food that were placed neatly in front of everyone seated around Tyler and Olivia. No one approached the small side table where I was sitting. I watched quietly as glasses were raised for the first toast of the evening, and people clapped enthusiastically when Tyler stood up to give a speech about how happy he was to have found Olivia. Ty moved slowly while I remained in that corner near the service station, listening to fragments of conversations drift across the rooftop, while waiters occasionally passed by carrying trays. I sat there for nearly 2 hours while the evening continued exactly as planned. There were speeches from Olivia's parents praising the couple and stories from friends who described how perfect Tyler and Olivia were together. Guests stood up to take photos in front of the skyline, while someone brought out another round of champagne for the main table. Throughout the entire celebration, no one came over to speak with me or check whether I had eaten. No waiter stopped to ask if I wanted a plate. No family member walked across the room to thank me for organizing the venue or paying the deposit that made the evening possible. I remained in that folding chair, watching everything unfold from a distance that felt both physically small and emotionally enormous. At some point, I realized that the bottle of champagne I had brought was still sitting unopened beside my feet. I had originally imagined handing it to Tyler with a congratulatory handshake, or placing it on the table as a gift for the couple to enjoy during their celebration. Instead, it stayed there untouched while the evening carried on without me. Sitting there quietly, listening to laughter echo across the rooftop while the lights of Chicago shimmer behind a railing, a slow and uncomfortable realization settled into my mind. I had not been treated like a brother who belonged at that table. I had been treated like someone who happened to be present in the room, but did not truly matter to the people celebrating. In that moment, the distance I felt for years inside my own family stopped being subtle or abstract and became painfully clear. I was not just a dependable one who handled responsibilities behind the scenes. To them, I was something closer to a stranger who had simply wandered into the wrong place and politely taken a seat where he would not disturb anyone. By the time the evening started, winding down the rooftop had taken on that slightly slower atmosphere that happens after several hours of celebration, when conversations become softer and guests begin checking their phones or gathering their coats while still lingering near the tables. The city lights beyond the railing looked brighter against the dark sky, and the decorative lamps above the tables cast long reflections across the glass surfaces. I was still sitting in the same folding chair near the service station where Tyler had pointed earlier, my posture stiff from remaining there for so long, watching people stand up from the main table after finishing dessert and their final glasses of wine. Throughout the entire evening, no one had invited me to join the group or even walked over to speak with me for more than a brief passing greeting. At some point, I stopped expecting anyone to acknowledge my presence at all. The champagne bottle I had brought still rested unopened beside my chair, and the engagement card I had carefully written earlier that day remained on the small side table where I had placed it when I first sat down. The card suddenly felt unnecessary now, almost embarrassing, like a gesture that belonged to a different version of the evening that had never actually happened. Eventually, the waiters began clearing empty plates and stacking glasses, while guests slowly drifted away from the table to admire the skyline or continue conversations in smaller groups. I noticed one of the servers speaking quietly with the restaurant manager near the service station as they organized paperwork from the evening. A few minutes later, the same waiter approached the main table carrying a dark leather folder that I recognized immediately as the final bill for the event. From my seat, I could see him standing beside Tyler and Olivia while they continued chatting with Olivia's parents. The waiter maintained a polite professional posture restaurant staff often use when handling expensive reservations, holding the folder carefully with both hands as he waited for a pause in the conversation. When Tyler finally looked up, the waiter leaned slightly forward and spoke in a calm voice that carried clearly across the relatively quiet rooftop. He explained that the evening's total came to $3,980 and asked if they would like the remaining balance charged to the same credit card that had been used earlier to place the reservation deposit. For a brief moment, Tyler looked confused, as if the question had interrupted his train of thought. Then he casually turned his head and glanced across the rooftop until his eyes landed on me sitting alone near the service station. The expression on his face did not show even the slightest hint of hesitation or embarrassment. Instead, he gave a small shrug and nodded in my direction, while speaking to the waiter with the same relaxed confidence he had carried all evening. "Yeah, he's covering it." The sentence floated across the rooftop so casually that it almost sounded like an afterthought. For the first time all night, every person near the table turned their attention toward me at the exact same moment. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to people's lips. Olivia's parents followed Tyler's gaze until their eyes also settled on me sitting alone in that folding chair beside the trash bin. I felt the weight of all those eyes land on me simultaneously. For a few seconds, I remained seated, letting the silence stretch across the space while the waiter waited politely for confirmation. Something inside me felt strangely calm in that moment, the kind of quiet clarity that sometimes arrives after a long period of discomfort when a situation finally becomes impossible to ignore. I stood up slowly from the folding chair, picking up my coat from the backrest and smoothing the front of my jacket as if I were simply preparing to leave after a normal dinner. The rooftop was so quiet now that I could hear the faint sound of traffic far below the building. Every guest remained focused on me, waiting for the expected response that would allow the evening to end smoothly. Instead, I spoke clearly enough for everyone standing around the table to hear my voice without needing to raise it. Sorry, I was told this table was for family only. The word seemed to settle over the group like a sudden drop in temperature. No one laughed this time. The earlier humor that had followed Tyler's common hours before had completely disappeared. I could see confusion forming on several faces, while others shifted uncomfortably where they stood. I continued speaking in the same calm tone, explaining that I had not eaten any of the food served at the table, had not been offered a drink during the entire evening, and had not participated in the celebration because it had been made very clear that I was not actually welcome there. My voice remained steady as I spoke, not angry or dramatic, simply stating what had happened in plain terms. If I am not considered family at this table, then I am not responsible for paying for the family celebration. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything earlier in the evening. Even the waiters had stopped moving for a moment as the situation unfolded. I turned toward the server who was still holding the leather folder and thanked him politely for his work throughout the night, making sure my tone carried none of the tension now hanging in the air. Then I slipped my coat over my shoulders, picked up the unopened bottle of champagne from beside the chair, and walked calmly toward the exit of the rooftop, without looking back at the table where the celebration had taken place. I had only taken a few steps away from the table when the silence behind me finally cracked. Chairs shifted sharply against the floor and several voices started talking at once, the calm celebratory atmosphere from earlier in the evening collapsing almost instantly into confusion and tension. Tyler's voice rose above the others first, louder than usual and carrying a sharp edge that had not been there earlier when he was making jokes and giving speeches. He called my name with an irritated laugh that sounded forced, the kind of laugh someone uses when they suddenly realize a situation is spiraling away from them and they are trying to pull it back under control in front of an audience. I stopped walking but did not turn around immediately. The rooftop had grown strangely quiet except for his voice and the faint clatter of dishes from the service station where the staff had paused their work to watch what was happening. "Nathan, come on, don't do this," he said, his tone shifting quickly from annoyed to defensive. It was just a joke. I slowly turned back toward the table then, still holding my coat in one hand and the champagne bottle in the other. Nearly everyone was standing now, forming a loose circle around the main table where the leather folder containing the bill still rested in the waiter's hands. Tyler looked uncomfortable in a way I had rarely seen before, his confident posture from earlier replaced by restless movements as he ran a hand through his hair. He kept talking, explaining to the surrounding guests that the seating arrangement had never been meant seriously, and that I was overreacting to something harmless. The words came quickly, almost stumbling over each other as he tried to reshape the story of what had happened earlier in the evening. According to him, the folding chair had simply been part of a joke between brothers, the kind of thing that was supposed to be funny. My mother quickly stepped into the conversation as well, her voice softer, but equally eager to smooth the situation over before it became more uncomfortable for everyone watching. She gave me the same familiar look she had used many times before whenever Tyler caused some kind of problem, and I was expected to be the reasonable one who let things go. "Nathan, sweetheart, you know how your brother is," she said with a small nervous smile directed toward the guests. "You have always been a little sensitive about these things." The sentence landed with a dull heaviness that felt strangely familiar, like hearing a line from a script that had been repeated throughout my life whenever Tyler crossed a line and someone needed to explain it away. Around the table, a few guests shifted awkwardly while pretending to study their drinks or the skyline behind the railing. Then another voice entered the conversation, calm but firm enough that the entire group turned toward it immediately. Olivia's father had been standing near the edge of the table listening quietly while Tyler and my mother tried to downplay the situation. Gregory Harper was a tall man with a controlled, serious expression that had remained mostly neutral during the celebration earlier in the evening, the expression of someone used to observing situations carefully before speaking. Now that expression had hardened into visible irritation. He looked directly at Tyler rather than at me when he spoke, his voice measured but carrying a weight that immediately silenced the remaining whispers around the table. He asked Tyler a simple question that cut through all the nervous explanations and awkward laughter that had filled the past minute. Why invite someone to an event he funded only to humiliate him in front of everyone? No one answered right away. Tyler opened his mouth slightly as if preparing a response, but nothing came out. My mother glanced toward my father, who had suddenly become very interested in the skyline beyond the rooftop railing. Olivia remained beside Tyler with an uncertain expression, clearly realizing that the situation had turned into something far more serious than an uncomfortable joke between brothers. The restaurant staff stood nearby waiting for direction, the waiter still holding the leather folder, while the manager watched the group with polite but growing impatience. The festive energy that had filled the rooftop earlier was completely gone now, replaced by an uncomfortable stillness that made the entire space feel colder despite the warm lights overhead. Gregory Harper continued looking at Tyler, waiting for an explanation that never seemed to arrive. Eventually, Tyler muttered something vague about how everyone in our family teased each other and how the comment had been taken out of context. The words sounded weak even to him, and several people at the table exchanged uneasy glances. I stepped slightly closer to the group then, speaking calmly again so the situation remained clear. I reminded them that I had already paid the reservation deposit weeks earlier and had coordinated the entire event with the restaurant staff, so the evening could happen exactly as planned. My tone remained steady because the facts themselves did not require anger or exaggeration. I explained that I had been asked to handle the reservation, arrange the decorations, and secure the private rooftop space because the family needed someone dependable to make sure everything was organized properly. I had done exactly that without hesitation. What happened after I arrived had been very different. The waiter still waited patiently beside the table, the leather folder now resting open in his hands as he glanced between the guests and the manager for guidance. The number written on the bill remained visible beneath the soft lighting above the table. I looked once more at Tyler, my parents, and the group of guests around them before speaking one final time. I had already contributed what I agreed to contribute when I secured the reservation. The rest of the evening had clearly been reserved for family. With that, I gave a small, polite nod to the restaurant staff, turned away from the table again, and walked toward the exit of the rooftop, while the conversation behind me remained frozen in a tense silence that no one seemed ready to break. By the time I left the restaurant, the night air in Chicago felt colder than it had earlier when I first arrived. The city was still alive with traffic and distant noise from the streets below, but everything inside my head felt strangely quiet after the tension that had filled the rooftop during those final minutes. I walked several blocks without any clear destination in mind, just letting the rhythm of my steps settle the lingering adrenaline that always comes after a confrontation you never expected to have. Eventually, I returned to my hotel, placed the unopened bottle of champagne on the small desk near the window, and loosened my tie while looking out at the skyline that had seemed so impressive only a few hours earlier. My phone had been silent while I was walking back, but the moment I set it down on the desk, the screen lit up with a series of notifications that had clearly been waiting for my attention. The messages were all from family members. The first one was from Tyler, followed quickly by several from my mother and one from my father. Even before opening them, I already knew the tone they would carry, because I had experienced similar reactions many times whenever a situation threatened to disrupt the carefully maintained version of family harmony they prefer to present to others. Tyler's message was the longest and the most aggressive. He accused me of humiliating him in front of Olivia's entire family, and claimed that I had completely overreacted to what he still insisted had only been a harmless joke. According to him, I had created unnecessary drama during one of the most important nights of his life, and now everyone was talking about the argument instead of celebrating the engagement. The message ended with a complaint that I had embarrassed our parents and made the entire evening awkward for guests who had nothing to do with the situation. My mother's messages arrived one after another in quick succession, each one carrying that familiar tone of disappointment mixed with frustration that she often used whenever she believed I had behaved unfairly toward Tyler. She wrote that she could not believe I had chosen that moment to make a scene, and that I should have simply handled the bill quietly the way we had discussed earlier. She repeated several times that the situation would have resolved itself later, if I had just been patient and avoided causing public tension between the families. My father's message was shorter, but carried the same underlying accusation. He wrote that I had ruined what was supposed to be a joyful evening, and that I should have spoken to Tyler privately instead of refusing the payment in front of everyone. I read each message slowly while sitting on the edge of the hotel bed, noticing that none of them acknowledged what had actually happened earlier when I arrived at the rooftop and was directed toward that folding chair beside the service station. None of them mentioned the 2 hours I had spent sitting alone while the celebration continued without me. The entire focus of their anger was centered on the final moment when I declined to pay the remaining bill. I placed the phone face down on the bedside table and sat quietly for a few minutes, letting the room settle into silence again. Part of me expected the messages to continue throughout the night, but instead the phone remained still for nearly half an hour. Then the screen lit up again with a call from a number I did not recognize. For a brief moment, I considered ignoring it, because I assumed it might be another relative or friend of Tyler's calling to express their opinion about what had happened. Instead, I answered, expecting another tense conversation. The voice on the other end belonged to Olivia. Her tone sounded completely different from the angry messages I had just read. She spoke carefully at first, almost cautiously, as if she was still processing the events of the evening, and wanted to make sure she understood them correctly. She explained that after I left the restaurant, the situation at the table had become increasingly uncomfortable, especially once her father began asking more direct questions about the bill and about the earlier comment Tyler had made regarding family. According to her, Tyler and my parents had already told Olivia's family weeks earlier that I had volunteered to pay for the entire engagement dinner as a generous gift to celebrate Tyler and Olivia's future together. They had described it as something I insisted on doing, because I was proud of my younger brother and wanted to contribute in a meaningful way. Olivia said her father had originally considered the gesture extremely thoughtful, especially since the reservation had already been placed before either family even met in person. Hearing that explanation felt like a strange piece of a puzzle suddenly falling into place. The deposit request from my mother weeks earlier, the casual assumption that the remaining bill would automatically be charged to my card, and Tyler's relaxed confidence when he pointed toward me while speaking to a waiter all made much more sense now. Olivia continued explaining that once I refused the payment and walked out, her father began questioning Tyler and my parents directly about the arrangement they had described earlier. The story they had presented no longer matched what had happened in front of everyone that night. According to her, the conversation became tense very quickly because Gregory Harper was not the kind of person who appreciated discovering that he had been misled during a formal family event. She told me that her father had been particularly irritated not only by the confusion over the bill, but by the way I had been treated earlier in the evening. Several guests had apparently noticed that I was sitting alone away from the main table for most of the celebration, something that seemed odd to Olivia's relatives even before the argument happened. The more Olivia described the scene after I left, the clearer it became that the comfortable image Tyler and my parents had tried to present earlier in the evening had completely unraveled once the details were questioned. Gregory Harper had apparently made it clear that he did not appreciate being told one story before the dinner and witnessing something entirely different once the event actually began. Olivia's voice grew quieter as she admitted that the entire situation had forced her to look at Tyler and my family in a very different light than she had before. She said the evening had revealed dynamics she had never fully noticed during the months she had been dating him. Watching the way everyone reacted, especially the way my parents immediately dismissed what had happened to me, had raised concerns she had not expected to have on a night that was supposed to celebrate their engagement. By the time the call ended, the tension between both families had clearly spread far beyond the simple question of who would pay for the dinner. What had started as an uncomfortable moment on a rooftop restaurant had exposed a much larger truth about how things actually work within my family, and now people who had only recently entered that world were beginning to see it clearly for the first time. The days that followed the engagement dinner unfolded in a way that felt almost unreal compared to the quiet routine my life usually followed. I returned to Denver the next morning and went back to work as if nothing unusual had happened. But the situation I had left behind in Chicago continued to grow far beyond that rooftop conversation. My phone kept receiving messages throughout the week, though the tone slowly shifted from the immediate anger I had seen that first night into something more strained and uncertain as the truth of the situation began spreading between both families. A few days after I returned home, Olivia called again and explained that her father had decided to review the restaurant invoice himself because he did not like unresolved financial questions hanging over family events. Gregory Harper apparently contacted the restaurant directly and requested a detailed copy of the reservation agreement, the deposit information, and the final bill from the evening. The documents confirmed exactly what I had explained that night. The reservation had been placed under my name weeks earlier, the deposit had been paid using my credit card, and there had been no arrangement on record suggesting I had volunteered to cover the entire event as a gift. Once those details were confirmed, the tone of the conversations between the families changed dramatically. Olivia told me that her father had been visibly irritated when he realized the version of events he had originally been told was completely inaccurate. According to her, he spoke directly with Tyler and my parents in a much more serious tone than the polite social atmosphere they had maintained during the dinner. He made it clear that misrepresenting the financial arrangement of an event in order to impress guests reflected poorly on everyone involved, and he was particularly bothered by the way Tyler had treated the person who had actually organized the evening. That conversation apparently created a level of tension that none of them had expected when the engagement was first announced. The comfortable momentum of wedding planning slowed almost immediately. Olivia began looking more closely at the behavior she had previously dismissed as harmless personality quirks in Tyler. She started noticing patterns that had not seemed significant before, small moments where he exaggerated stories, avoided responsibility for problems, or shifted blame toward other people whenever something did not go the way he wanted. Over the next several days, those observations began to stack together into a much clearer picture. She realized how often Tyler relied on other people to handle practical responsibilities, while still presenting himself as the center of attention. She noticed how easily he became defensive when someone questioned him, and how quickly he tried to redirect conversations away from uncomfortable topics. The situation with the dinner had forced her to examine all of those details more carefully than she ever had before. Eventually, she told me that the engagement had been called off entirely. The conversation where that decision happened had been long and emotional, but in the end, she no longer felt comfortable building a future with someone whose behavior had raised so many concerns in such a short period of time. The same event that was supposed to celebrate the beginning of their marriage had instead exposed problems that neither of them could ignore anymore. When that news reached Tyler, the reaction was immediate and explosive. My phone began lighting up again with messages from him that were completely different from the ones he had sent earlier in the week. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with desperation. He blamed me directly for the collapse of the engagement, insisting that none of this would have happened if I had simply paid the bill and allowed the evening to end normally. He called repeatedly, leaving voicemails where his voice shifted between frustration and pleading as he asked me to help repair the situation. According to him, Olivia was still upset about the entire incident, and he believed that if I explained everything differently or smoothed things over with her family, it might convince her to reconsider the engagement. Listening to those messages felt strange, because for the first time in my life, Tyler sounded genuinely unsure of himself. By that point, I had already made another decision, quietly during the days after the dinner. For years, Tyler had access to a shared bank account that originally existed to help him during periods when he struggled financially. I had kept that account open long after it stopped making sense, simply because it was easier than having another argument with my family about money. The balance in that account had gradually been used less responsibly over time, often covering expenses Tyler insisted were temporary, but never seemed to resolve. After everything that had happened, I finally logged into the account and closed it permanently. The remaining balance was transferred back into my personal account, and the debit card linked to Tyler's access was automatically deactivated by the bank once the account was shut down. 2 evenings later, my phone rang again while I was at home reviewing documents for work. Tyler's name appeared on the screen, and I answered calmly, already having a strong idea about why he was calling. His voice sounded panicked the moment he started speaking. He explained that he had been out trying to meet Olivia for dinner to talk about the situation one more time, hoping to convince her that everything had been misunderstood. When he tried to pay for the meal, his card had suddenly stopped working at the restaurant. He had attempted the transaction multiple times before realizing the card had been declined because the account it was connected to no longer existed. The embarrassment of that moment had apparently forced him to step outside the restaurant and call me immediately. He asked what had happened to the account and whether the bank had made some kind of mistake. I explained calmly that there was no mistake and that the account had been closed earlier that week. The silence on the other end of the line lasted several seconds before he started protesting again, saying that he still needed access to that money while he sorted out everything happening in his life. My response remained steady and simple. I reminded him of the comment he had made earlier that evening on the rooftop when he pointed toward the folding chair beside the service station. Those words had been very clear at the time. If I am not considered family, then I do not get access to family responsibilities. The same principle applied to family support. The weeks that followed felt strangely quiet compared to the chaos that had surrounded the engagement dinner. For the first time in a long while, my days were not filled with calls about someone else's problem that needed solving or requests that quietly turned into obligations. I continued going to work each morning, reviewing financial reports and attending meetings just like I had always done, but internally something had shifted in a way that was difficult to fully explain at first. News from my family arrived gradually rather than all at once. Tyler's situation deteriorated faster than anyone expected after the engagement collapsed. Without the financial safety nets he had always relied on, the gaps in his stability became much harder for him to ignore. Eventually, he moved back into my parents' house again, something that happened several times over the years whenever his plans fell apart. This time, the atmosphere surrounding that move was noticeably different. Instead of the familiar tone of optimism my parents usually use when explaining Tyler's circumstances, there was a quiet tension hanging over the situation that none of them seemed able to disguise anymore. I stayed mostly out of those conversations, For the first time in my life, I did not step in to solve the problem or offer financial help that would smooth things over temporarily. I listened politely when updates reached me, but kept a clear distance from the cycle that had repeated itself for so many years. At first, that distance felt uncomfortable, almost unnatural, because I had spent so long believing it was my responsibility to hold everything together whenever things started falling apart. About 3 weeks after the dinner, my mother asked if she could visit me in Denver. Her request surprised me because our conversation since the incident had been brief and cautious. When she arrived, she looked more tired than usual, the kind of exhaustion that comes from weeks of tension that no one fully knows how to resolve. We sat in my living room with coffee for a while before either of us addressed the obvious reason for the visit. For years, our conversations had followed predictable patterns where difficult topics were softened or redirected before they could become uncomfortable. That afternoon felt different. My mother eventually looked at me with an expression I had rarely seen from her before and began speaking slowly, as if choosing her words carefully. She admitted that the dinner in Chicago had forced her to confront things she had ignored for a very long time. Watching the situation unfold in front of Olivia's family had apparently made it impossible for her to pretend that our family dynamics were harmless or balanced. She said she had spent the weeks afterward thinking about the many times I had stepped in to help while Tyler avoided responsibility, and about how easily everyone had accepted my support without acknowledging the cost. Then she apologized. The apology was simple and direct in a way I had never heard from her before. She said she was sorry for years of favoritism and for the way she had taken my reliability for granted. She admitted that she had often expected me to quietly fix situations that Tyler created because it was easier than holding him accountable. Hearing those words felt almost surreal because I had spent so many years assuming that kind of recognition would never come. We talked for a long time that afternoon, not trying to repair everything immediately, but acknowledging the truth of how things had worked in our family. The conversation did not magically resolve every problem between us, and neither of us pretended it would. But it was the first time my mother had openly recognized the imbalance that had shaped most of my life. After she left, I spent several days reflecting on everything that had happened since that night on the rooftop. The realization that stayed with me the most was that refusing to pay that bill had never really been about money. The amount itself was insignificant compared to what I had quietly contributed over the years. What mattered was a moment when I stopped accepting a role that required me to sit silently at the edge of my own life, while everyone else decided where I belonged. For the first time in years, I started making decisions that had nothing to do with fixing someone else's problems. One of the first things I did was book a trip through several cities in Europe, something I had originally planned years earlier before canceling it when my parents needed financial help during a difficult period. That trip had always remained in the back of my mind as one of those things I would eventually do once everything else in my family settled down. I finally realized that waiting for the perfect moment had only kept me standing still. Around the same time, I also began seeing a therapist, something I had considered occasionally but never prioritized. Those conversations helped me understand how deeply my identity had been shaped by the role of being the dependable one who solved problems without expecting acknowledgement. Learning to set boundaries felt unfamiliar at first, almost like practicing a language I had never spoken before. Gradually, those boundaries began to feel less like walls and more like necessary structure. My relationship with my family remained uncertain, but for the first time I was no longer trying to carry the entire weight of that uncertainty by myself. Sometimes I still think about that folding chair near the service station on the rooftop in Chicago, the place where I sat for nearly 2 hours watching a celebration that had been organized with my help but never truly meant for me. For years I had accepted similar positions in quieter ways, always assuming that being patient and dependable would eventually earn me a place at the table. The night I refused to pay the bill was the moment that pattern finally ended. It was the first time I stood up from that chair and chose to walk away instead of pretending the arrangement was normal. Now, when I look at the life I am building, it no longer feels like I am waiting for someone else to make space for me. For the first time, I am not sitting quietly at the edge of someone else's celebration, hoping to be included. I am creating my own direction, my own priorities, and my own boundaries. For the first time in my life, I am not sitting at someone else's table. I am building my own.